The planet was alive with the sounds of chaos. Explosions rattled the air, and the sky was filled with the smoke of burning ships. Vela, the young and brave alien princess of the Orcs people, stood at the front lines of the battle. She was a natural leader, commanding her troops with authority and grace. But today, the battle was not going in their favor. The Orcs forces were outnumbered and outgunned by a powerful rival faction, the Zeniths, known for their ruthless tactics and advanced technology. Vela's sleek, silver armor glimmered in the harsh light of the battlefield. Her bright green eyes scanned the horizon, where she could see the enemy soldiers closing in from all sides. The Orcs people were a peaceful race, but their world had been taken over by these invaders, and now they were fighting desperately to regain control. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and the distant sound of weapons clashing. Vela's orders were clear: hold the line at all costs. She had trained her soldiers well, and they fought fiercely under her leadership. Yet, despite their best efforts, the Zeniths were relentless. Their weaponry was superior, and they attacked with terrifying precision. One by one, the Orc soldiers fell, their cries lost in the noise of the battlefield. Vela's heart pounded in her chest as she swung her sword, cutting down an enemy soldier who had tried to approach her. She could see the fear in the eyes of her people, but there was no turning back now. The Orcs could not afford to lose this battle. But then, disaster struck. A massive explosion erupted just a few feet from where she stood, throwing her off her feet. Her body slammed against the ground, and pain shot through her side as she struggled to rise. Blood stained her silver armor, and she felt the world spinning around her. Her vision blurred, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Before she could get up, the ground beneath her trembled, and she felt a sharp pain in her leg. The enemy had struck again, and this time, the blow was too much. The battle continued around her, but she was no longer part of it. With her strength fading, Vela fell to the ground, her vision darkening. As the smoke cleared, the Orcs forces were retreating, their morale shattered by the relentless assault. Vela, the princess who had fought so hard to protect her people, was abandoned on the battlefield. Her people, seeing that their princess had fallen, fled without a second thought, leaving her behind. The Zenith forces advanced, their cold eyes scanning the fallen Orc soldiers. They paid no attention to the injured princess lying motionless among the wreckage. She was nothing to them, just another casualty in the war they were winning. But Vela wasn't just a casualty. She was the future of her people, the last hope for the Orcs. If she died here, everything would be lost. Yet no one seemed to notice. No one cared. The Zeniths were too focused on their victory to spare a thought for the wounded princess. As the enemy moved further into the battlefield, Vela lay there, helpless and alone. She had no strength left to call for help, and the world around her grew quieter with each passing second. The pain in her side was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the deep ache in her heart. She had given everything for her people, only to be abandoned when she was most vulnerable. Time seemed to stretch on, but eventually the sounds of the battlefield faded into the distance. The Zeniths had moved on, leaving her behind, forgotten. Vela's thoughts drifted in and out of consciousness. She was losing hope. The coldness of the ground seeped into her skin, and the night began to fall. But just as Vela's mind started to fade completely, she heard something. A sound. A voice? She couldn't be sure. Her body felt like it was giving up, but she fought to stay awake. She had to hold on, just a little longer. She had to believe that someone, anyone, would find her. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, and through the haze, she saw a figure in the distance, a human. It was blurry at first, but as the figure approached, she could see the unmistakable silhouette of a soldier walking toward her with purpose. Her heart gave a faint flutter of hope. Could it be a human? Had she been found at last? Captain Mark Hudson had seen his fair share of battles. As a soldier in the Earth's military, he had been deployed to countless conflict zones across different planets. But nothing had prepared him for the desolation he found on the war-torn planet of Exaron 5. The planet was a mess of craters, burned-out ships, and the remains of once thriving settlements. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of smoke lingered in the atmosphere. Mark's mission was simple: assist in peacekeeping efforts between the Orcs people and the Zeniths, two alien races locked in a fierce conflict. But as he landed on the planet, it quickly became clear that peace was a far-off dream. The Orcs forces were losing ground, and Mark's job had shifted from peacekeeper to rescue operator. He had been tasked with locating survivors and getting them to safety. He moved cautiously through the ruins of the battlefield, his boots crunching on the debris underfoot. His eyes scanned the area, alert to any signs of life. Most of the Orc soldiers had retreated, and the Zenith forces were slowly moving in, ensuring that no one was left standing. Mark had no intention of letting the Zeniths find any survivors, but he knew that time was running out. Then, as he rounded a corner of a destroyed building, he spotted something. His heart skipped a beat. There, lying in the dirt, was a figure, an alien woman, unconscious and bloodied. Her silver armor gleamed in the dim light, and her long, dark hair was matted with blood. She was alive, but barely. Mark's military instincts kicked in. He rushed to her side, kneeling down to assess her injuries. At first glance, it was clear that she was in bad shape. Her leg was twisted in an unnatural way, and there were deep gashes on her side. Her breathing was shallow, and her pulse was weak. Mark's heart sank. He knew he didn't have much time. The enemy could return at any moment, and if they found her, she would be finished. Without a second thought, Mark lifted the alien princess into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her injuries were severe. He glanced around, trying to determine the best course of action. He couldn't just leave her here. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere the Zeniths wouldn't be able to find her. Mark carefully carried her through the wreckage, moving as quickly as he could without drawing attention. He was a trained soldier, but even he had never experienced a situation like this before. The Oryx princess, her life hanging by a thread, was in his care, and he had no idea who she was, what her people's conflict was about, or how to get her the medical attention she needed. As he moved deeper into the abandoned battlefield, he found an old, run-down building. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Mark laid the princess down gently on a flat surface and began to assess her injuries. He had some basic first aid training, but he was no doctor. He did what he could, applying pressure to the worst of her wounds and trying to stop the bleeding. But it was clear that he was out of his depth. He needed more than just bandages and antiseptic. Mark cursed under his breath. His mission wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to be in the middle of an alien war, saving an injured princess. But here he was. The silence of the building was only interrupted by the princess's faint breathing. Mark watched her closely, waiting for any sign that she was regaining consciousness. The minutes dragged on, and he felt a strange sense of helplessness wash over him. He was used to fighting, used to the chaos of battle, but this was different. He was fighting to save a life, not just his own. As the hours passed, Mark kept vigil over her, watching as her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. The princess hadn't stirred, but Mark refused to leave her side. He wasn't sure why, but there was something about her, something that made him want to protect her. He couldn't explain it, but it was a feeling he couldn't ignore. Finally, just as the light from the setting sun began to fade, Mark saw the princess's eyelids flutter. She groaned softly, her fingers twitching. Mark's heart leaped in his chest. She was waking up. Her green eyes slowly opened, and she blinked as though trying to make sense of her surroundings. When she saw Mark, her expression turned from confusion to fear. She tried to move, but the pain from her injury stopped her. "Easy," Mark said softly, holding up a hand to calm her. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." The princess's eyes narrowed, and she spoke in a language Mark didn't understand. But the tone was clear. She was demanding answers. Mark didn't have any to give, but he could tell that she was strong, and that her will to survive was just as strong as his desire to protect her. "Rest," Mark said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to heal. I'll keep you safe." And with that, Mark vowed to do everything he could to ensure the princess would survive. He had saved her once, but the real challenge was just beginning. As days passed, Mark and the injured princess, Vela, began to form a routine. Mark stayed by her side, helping her recover and providing what little comfort he could. The building they were hiding in, though old and decrepit, was safe. For now, Mark kept watch while Vela rested, her strength slowly returning. Vela's injuries were severe, but with Mark's help, her wounds began to heal. He used the few medical supplies he had left to dress her injuries, and every now and then, he would manage to find food and water. He wasn't a doctor, but he did his best to tend to her. There was something about her that made him want to protect her, to ensure that she survived this war. Vela, still weak from her injuries, remained silent most of the time. She spoke little, unsure of who Mark was or what he intended. She had no reason to trust him. He was human, from a race that was unfamiliar to her. But she couldn't deny that, despite the circumstances, he had saved her life. And for that, she owed him something, even if she couldn't put her gratitude into words. One day, as Vela lay resting on a makeshift bed Mark had set up for her, she found herself staring at him. Mark had removed his helmet, his face now fully visible. His short, brown hair was slightly messy, and his eyes, though tired, held a sense of determination. His strong arms were covered in a mix of dirt and sweat, a testament to the work he had done to keep them both alive. Vela studied him quietly, wondering about the man who had risked his life for her. She had heard stories of humans, stories from her people, but this was different. This man had shown her kindness and care when her own people had abandoned her. She was still unsure of what to make of him, but there was something in his gaze that made her feel safe. Mark noticed her watching him and paused. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he could sense that she was beginning to trust him, just a little bit. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, the best he could do under the circumstances. "You're looking better," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" Vela blinked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Better. But I need to get back. I need to find my people." Mark frowned, but he understood. She was a princess after all. She had duties, responsibilities. He didn't know much about her people, the Orcs, but he knew they were at war with the Zeniths. It was a war that had taken everything from her. "I understand," he said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "But right now, you're not strong enough. We'll wait until you're healed. You'll need all your strength if you want to go back." Vela's green eyes flickered with frustration, but she said nothing more. She had always been a warrior, someone who led her people with strength and conviction. Being dependent on someone else, especially a human, was not something she was accustomed to. Yet, she had no choice. Her body was still weak, and Mark was the only one who had shown any care for her survival. Days turned into weeks, and during that time, their bond grew stronger. Vela found herself trusting Mark more and more. He would speak to her, telling her stories of his life back on Earth, of his family, his training, and his hopes for a better future. Though she didn't fully understand everything about his world, his kindness and persistence began to break down the walls she had built around herself. Mark, in turn, began to learn about Vela's people. She told him of the Orcs, peaceful beings with a deep connection to nature and the stars. They had once lived in harmony with the universe, but now their world was torn apart by war. The Zeniths had come from another galaxy, bringing destruction and chaos in their wake. Vela had fought to protect her people, but she had been betrayed by those she trusted, left to die on the battlefield. Vela's strength and resilience amazed Mark. He had seen many soldiers, but none like her. Despite everything she had endured, she never gave up. Her spirit, though scared, remained unbroken. One evening, as the sun began to set, Mark sat beside Vela as they watched the sky. The stars began to twinkle, and the cool night air carried a sense of peace, something neither of them had felt in a long time. "I'll get you back to your people, Vela," Mark said, his voice filled with determination. "I promise." Vela turned her gaze toward him, her expression softening. For the first time since she had been injured, she believed him. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and in that moment, she realized that he wasn't just some soldier following orders. He had become something more to her, someone she could trust, someone who cared about her survival. "Thank you, Mark," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will not forget this." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't have to. I'll always be here to help." And in that moment, as the stars filled the sky above them, they both knew that their paths were forever intertwined. The war that had brought them together was far from over, but they would face it together, each finding strength in the other. Mark knew that their time in the abandoned building was running out. It had been a few weeks since he found Vela, and while she had made great progress in her recovery, she was still far from being fully healed. The longer they stayed in one place, the more dangerous it became. The Zeniths could be searching the area at any moment, and Mark needed to move them both to a safer location. "Vela," Mark said one morning as he approached her resting spot. She had been lying on the makeshift bed, her eyes closed, but she was awake. "We need to get moving soon. You're getting stronger, but we can't stay here forever." Vela turned her head, her green eyes meeting his. She nodded slightly, understanding the urgency in his voice. The time to leave was approaching, but she wasn't sure what kind of world she would be returning to. Her people, the Orcs, were scattered, their once proud society torn apart by war. She had no idea where to go or who to trust. "I understand," she said softly, her voice still weak but determined. "But we need to be careful. My enemies will be looking for me." Mark frowned. He had heard bits and pieces about the Orcs and the Zeniths, but he didn't fully understand the complexities of their conflict. He only knew that Vela was a key figure in the war, and her survival could make a difference. That was enough reason for him to keep her safe. "I'll keep you safe," he reassured her. "I promise. But we need to move quickly." Mark spent the next few hours gathering what supplies they could salvage from the ruins. There wasn't much: water, food rations, and a few medical supplies. But it would have to do. He had a plan to get them to a hidden Oryx base, a place where they could regroup and possibly find some allies. But first, they needed to cross a dangerous stretch of land, one that was heavily patrolled by the Zeniths. "We'll have to be careful," Mark said, packing their supplies into a small portable bag. "The Zeniths have patrols all over this area. We'll need to move under the cover of night." Vela nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I can fight if necessary," she said, her voice firm. She had been trained to fight since she was young, and even injured, her skills were still sharper than most. "But I'm not as strong as I should be. We'll need to rely on stealth." Mark agreed. Their best chance of survival was to avoid detection. He didn't want to put Vela in a situation where she would have to fight if she wasn't ready. The Zeniths were ruthless, and even though Mark had faced enemies on many different planets, he knew that this war was unlike anything he had ever encountered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Mark and Vela set off. The air was thick with dust, and the remnants of the destroyed city loomed around them like silent sentinels. Mark led the way, keeping an eye on the horizon for any signs of movement. He had been trained for situations like this, but with Vela's injuries, it made everything more complicated. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Mark had a good sense of direction, but the terrain was difficult to navigate, especially at night. The ruins of the city made it hard to find a safe path, and every step felt like it could lead them straight into the hands of the enemy. Vela kept close to Mark, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. She had always been the one in command, the one giving orders, but now she had to rely on Mark. There was a sense of humility in that, and while it was hard for her to admit, she was beginning to trust him more than anyone else she had ever known. They reached a small hill, offering a slight vantage point of the area ahead. Mark crouched down, signaling for Vela to stay low. The faint sound of distant voices reached their ears, the unmistakable chatter of Zenith soldiers. Mark motioned for them to stay still, his heart racing in his chest. They couldn't afford to be seen now. Vela's breath was shallow, but she didn't speak. She was alert, her senses heightened as she observed the movements of the Zenith patrols. Mark watched her carefully, noticing how her muscles tensed with every sound, every shift in the wind. She was a warrior, and even in this vulnerable state, she exuded strength. They waited in silence for what felt like an eternity, the distant voices of the enemy growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Mark breathed a sigh of relief. "We're clear," he whispered, though he didn't fully trust that they were safe. The Zeniths could be anywhere. They continued on their journey, moving through the night, their steps slow and cautious. The darkness worked in their favor, providing them with cover, but it also made the journey more perilous. Mark kept a tight grip on the bag of supplies, making sure it didn't jostle too much. He knew that even the slightest sound could alert the Zeniths to their presence. Hours passed before they finally reached a safe spot, a small cave nestled between two cliffs, hidden from view. It was a tight space, but it would offer them protection for the night. They would rest here until morning, then continue on their journey. Vela collapsed onto the ground, exhausted from the long trek. Mark sat beside her, watching the dark sky above. He was tired, but he felt a sense of relief. They had made it through another day. "We'll keep moving at first light," Mark said softly, glancing at Vela. She was already drifting off to sleep, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. And as Mark watched over her, he knew that their journey was far from over. But together, they would face whatever came next. As dawn's light began to break over the horizon, Mark and Vela emerged from their hiding place. The cave had given them a much-needed rest, but now they had to continue their journey. The risk of staying in one place for too long was too high, and they both knew the Zeniths were relentless in their search for the Orcs princess. Mark gathered their few belongings, water, food, and the medical supplies, and motioned for Vela to follow. The morning air was crisp, and the ground was still damp with the remnants of last night's fog. They moved silently through the underbrush, keeping low to avoid any possible patrols. Vela was stronger than she had been the day before, but the toll of their journey was starting to show. Her movements were slower, more deliberate. Mark could see the fatigue in her eyes, but she said nothing. She didn't want to appear weak, not even to the soldier who had risked so much to save her. "How are you feeling?" Mark asked, glancing over his shoulder to check on her. Vela gave him a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just tired." Mark nodded, understanding that she wasn't going to ask for help, no matter how much she needed it. He had learned that about her in the short time they had spent together. She was proud, strong, and stubborn, but he also knew she wasn't invincible, and that worried him. They continued on for hours, weaving through dense forest and rocky terrain. Every so often, they would stop to rest, but the threat of the Zeniths pushed them forward. The thought of being caught was too dangerous to even consider. Around midday, they came to a small stream. The sound of rushing water was a welcome relief, and Mark took a moment to fill their canteens. He glanced up at Vela as she knelt by the water, her gaze distant. "What's on your mind?" Mark asked, sensing the change in her. Vela paused, staring at her reflection in the water before speaking. "I don't know where to go from here. I don't know who I can trust anymore." Mark was quiet for a moment. He could sense her inner turmoil. She had once been a leader among her people, someone with a clear purpose. But now, everything seemed uncertain. The war had taken everything from her. The throne, her family, her people, and now even her own future seemed fragile. "You can trust me," Mark said, his voice firm. "I don't know what's going on with your people, but I'll make sure you get somewhere safe. I won't let anything happen to you." Vela turned to him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the sincerity in his words, and for the first time since she had been rescued, a small sense of peace settled over her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone who cared, someone willing to fight for her survival. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark smiled at her, though it was tinged with worry. He knew the dangers ahead were far from over. They were still in enemy territory, and the Zeniths were never far behind. "Let's get moving," he said, helping her back to her feet. "We can rest more once we're in a safer place." They continued their trek, their pace slower now that Vela's strength was waning, but Mark stayed close to her side. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, but the path was not without its challenges. By the time evening came, they were still a few hours away from their destination, an old abandoned Orcs outpost that Mark had learned about from some local contacts. It was said to be hidden deep within the forest, well off the beaten path. If they could get there, they would have a chance to regroup, plan their next move, and hopefully make contact with any remaining Orcs forces. As they set up camp for the night, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling in his chest. The Zeniths were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had found Vela. Mark had learned the hard way that no one could run forever. "We'll be fine," he muttered to himself, though he didn't feel convinced. He needed to keep Vela safe, no matter the cost. Vela lay on the ground, looking up at the stars above. She was exhausted, but her mind was still racing. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. The journey ahead was still dangerous, but with Mark by her side, she felt like they had a chance. "We'll make it," Vela said quietly, her voice full of determination. Mark looked over at her, his eyes filled with the same resolve. "I know we will." They both stared into the night, knowing the road ahead would be long and full of peril. But for the first time in weeks, they had something to fight for, a future that was still worth living for. The sun had just begun to set as Mark and Vela made their way through the dense forest. They had been walking for hours, but they were finally close to their destination. The abandoned Oryx outpost was not far now. Mark could sense the change in the air, the quiet, the stillness that meant they were getting closer to safety. But safety was always a fragile thing, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Zeniths were relentless, and they had been on their trail for days. Mark knew they wouldn't give up easily, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. Vela, though visibly tired, walked with a steady determination. Mark admired her strength. She had been through so much, but she still carried herself with a sense of purpose. She had been a princess, a leader, and now she was a fugitive, with nothing left but her survival instincts and the bond she had formed with him. "How much farther?" Vela asked, her voice betraying a hint of exhaustion. Mark glanced ahead, scanning the path. "Not far now. We'll be there soon. Just keep going." Vela nodded, though she didn't speak again. The journey had taken its toll on her. She hadn't been used to traveling so far under such dangerous circumstances. She had once commanded armies, given speeches to crowds, and lived a life of luxury. But now, everything was different. The two of them moved on, both lost in their thoughts. Vela's mind was on the Oryx people, on her fallen kingdom, and the future she had once envisioned for herself. She had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, that she would be running through forests and hiding from enemies. But here she was, surviving, thanks to Mark. And Mark, for his part, was thinking of the future too. He didn't know what would happen once they reached the outpost. Would they find allies there? Would they be safe for long? There were too many unknowns, but one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't leaving Vela. Not now. Not ever. The trees began to thin, and the outline of the outpost came into view. It was an old structure built into the side of a rocky hill. It had been abandoned for years, but it still looked strong. There were no signs of life around it, which Mark took as a good sign. "We made it," Mark said, his voice filled with relief. Vela didn't respond right away. She took in the sight of the outpost, her expression unreadable. It was a reminder of everything she had lost, and yet it was a symbol of hope too. If they could reach it, they might be able to find answers, or at least some temporary peace. They made their way up to the entrance, where Mark cautiously checked for any signs of danger. The area seemed clear, so he gestured for Vela to follow him inside. The building was quiet, but Mark could hear the faint sounds of equipment humming in the background. The Orcs had once used this place as a command center. Inside, it was dim, but not completely dark. The air smelled of old machinery and dust, but it still had a sense of familiarity to it. Mark moved to the control panel and began to inspect it, looking for anything useful. Vela stood by the entrance, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She had been here before, though it had been years. Back then, this place had been full of activity, filled with her people. Now it was just a shell, a reminder of the world that was slipping away. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. "I think I found something. There's a secure comms system here. We might be able to reach someone." Vela walked over to him, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the controls. She didn't know much about technology, but she trusted Mark's instincts. If he said it could help, it probably would. "Do you think we can contact the Oryx forces?" she asked, her voice low. Mark paused for a moment, then gave a small, reassuring smile. "I'm not sure, but we have to try." He began to work quickly, inputting commands and bringing up a screen full of static. The system was outdated, but there was still a chance. He adjusted a few settings, hoping to get a clearer signal. The minutes dragged on, and Mark could feel his anxiety rising. They couldn't afford to waste time. Then suddenly, the static cleared, and a voice crackled through the speakers. It was faint, but it was there. "This is Commander Herrick of the Oryx Resistance." "Who is this?" Mark's heart skipped a beat. They had made contact. "This is Mark, a human soldier. I've brought Princess Vela. We need help. The Zeniths are still hunting us." The voice on the other end paused for a moment, as if processing the information. Then Herrick spoke again. "We've been looking for her. Hold tight. We'll send a team to extract you. Stay where you are." Mark turned to Vela, who had been listening in silence. Her eyes were wide with shock, but there was something else there too. Hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. There were others out there who would fight for her. "We did it," Mark said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and triumph. "They're coming." Vela smiled, her heart lifting. For the first time since the fall of her kingdom, she allowed herself to believe in a future. It wasn't the future she had once imagined, but it was a future nonetheless. They were no longer fugitives, they were survivors. And together, they would rebuild.